Okay, folks, we're back. If you're in UK, it's finished for lunch, so we're starting session 3 in stage 1. So I'll kind of change the tack now. So we're looking at Errol Maul, who's in business development at Carden Associates. He's going to talk about hurricane insurance protection, Windex, controlled environment policies for US growers. So it's a very important part of the whole business, but not talked about very often in these fora. So I look forward to hearing about this. Errol, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Again, happy to be here. So today, the information I'm going to go over is just a very, brief overview of the insurance policies that are available in the U.S. for growers. There's definitely a lot of things out there that can cause issues with you as a grower and the grower's operation. So Carden and Associates, what we do, we're an insurance agency that specializes in crop insurance. And so, again, it's a very specialized niche market. And we want to make sure that the growers are covered, that they have, those different policies that are going to cover them for the worst case scenarios. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of 3 policies that are within the crop insurance market. And so again, with our limited time today, the biggest thing is just to give you an idea of what's out there, what's available. So again, nursery is a fairly sizable market within the US. Then there's also, we have a add-on product, which is called the hurricane policy. And then also a controlled environment policy, which is fairly new here in the US. So I'm going to kind of touch on those 3. And then again, like I said, with the limited time, it's just going to be a brief overview of each one of those. And then at the end, we'll have our contact information. So if you have any more interest or want to know more, feel free to reach out. So what is the Nursery Value Select program? It's essentially a subsidized insurance program for U.S. growers. And the way this works is it is administered by the United States Department of Agriculture under their Risk Management Agency, so the RMA. And it's essentially a way for growers to get themselves protection under these policies. So it's a fairly simple application process. There used to be an old policy called the Field Grown and Container Policy, which this is the NVS program is basically taking over and replaces that FG&C policy, which the FG&C policy used to have some very burdensome inventory requirements, and that's basically done away with that. And it essentially is a much easier process for the producers. Basically what it does, it just estimates the wholesale value of their product. So the first thing a lot of people ask is, what are important dates? So number 1 is May 1st for certain parts of the US. And then there's also September 1st sales closing, which means when that application has to be in. But the big thing to note here is that it's not a hard deadline. So those dates, you can actually go past those dates, but there's a 30-day waiting period for those applications. Once they've been submitted, then the coverage will attach on that 31st day after that application has been received and approved by the insurance provider. It is actually available in every state and county in the United States. So what are the coverage qualifications? So the biggest thing that producers have to realize is that this is for wholesale marketing. So at least 40% of the gross income for these producers have to be from wholesale. So whether that's to landscape companies, to other retailers, it has to be, again, that 40% number. You have to meet all requirements for insurability. Again, an agent can kind of go over what all is included in that. But basically, it has to be grown in appropriate medium and grown and sold with the root system attached. That's kind of a key point there. So the benefits of this NVS policy, it is a very personalized coverage. And again, there's different categories, plants. that you can insure. So you can insure, 1, 2, 3 categories. And again, you can decide how you want to do that. Again, you can personalize it based upon what the producer wants to do. So there are 10 plant categories. I'll show you what those are here shortly. And you'd basically submit a expected inventory value for each one of those. And then from there, you can decide what you want for coverage. So again, that's why it's called value select, the nursery value select. You can actually increase that value upward twice a year. And then those plant prices, it's essentially based upon that grower's sales records instead of a regional pricing for that individual plants. So again, if you as the producer can sell something for $20 per plant, and the neighbor down the road is selling it for $12, we're going to use your $20, what you're able to sell it for. It's a fairly simple loss adjustment process compared to what it used to be. So again, it's definitely something where an adjuster for the insurance company will work with that producer to be able to figure out what the loss is and go from there. There's also some additional options as part of this policy. There's the OLO, which is the current loss option. It basically reduces your claim. It's a 10% threshold. Once you cross 10% loss, then it will start to kick in a claim. So here are the different 10 plant categories that are part of this NVS policy. And again, we've got a large list that would show what genus species would fall into each one of these categories. So an agent can work with the producer to figure out what would fall into each one of these categories. So let's talk about a little bit, as far as the eligibility and what the covered perils are. Again, eligibility is, as I talked about, that selected value per insured plant category. You can't exceed the highest estimated monthly inventory for each of those plant categories. And there are different coverage level ranges, and I'll talk about that here shortly as well. Covered perils, it's essentially anything that Mother Nature can throw at the producer. So adverse weather conditions, fire, wildlife, earthquake, volcanic eruption. Again, as I mentioned, this is all 50 states. So, not everyone's going to have volcano within their area. But again, just know that it is a Mother Nature adverse weather, adverse weather conditions. So, there will be potentially insects, diseases, things like that are going to be part of this covered peril. So damage due to cold temperatures is part of that as well. So the different coverage levels range from 50 to 75%. When I talked about it's subsidized by the United States Department of Agriculture, is that, this is a way for the government to help producers and to essentially give them premium support for these different policies. So the higher the coverage level, the less subsidy, but again, it's total dollars you're paying. An example with the 60% policy, the producer is paying 36% of the total premium. So the OLO and the HIP policies are actually also available for purchase, as I will cover here shortly. And they also have what they consider a peak endorsement, which is available, which is fairly new as well. So the LOL is a buy-up option. It reduces that loss threshold to 10%, like I mentioned. The peak endorsement is new for this crop year, 2026. It's designed for growers such as poinsettias, mums, things like that, where they have one big peak season, one or two throughout the year. So what's a loss example for nursery? So number one is we're talking about this with as an OLO policy, buy-up. So if you have a basic coverage of 70%, you have a palms category of your $200,000 of value. Essentially, a 70% coverage is you have $140,000, which again, 70% of $200,000, and you have a $60,000 deductible. So under that standard nursery policy, if you have 250 queen palms valued at $200 a piece, for that loss, it would be $50,000 a loss. Under your standard policy, that's only a 25% loss. So you're not going to have a loss. No indemnity would be payable under that standard. But with the OLO policy, you now meet that 10%. So anything over 20,000, in this case, you have a $50,000 loss times 70% coverage. You now have a $35,000 indemnity that's due. Again, this OLO is additional cost for that, but again, you can see it definitely makes a difference on loss time when those smaller losses happen. What does it take to get a quote for an insured or a grower? You again have to have that 40%. It has to be wholesale. So you need a copy of the catalog, which is going to show their plants that they have available for sale and the cost of those. And we also, again, they need to select what their value is for each of those categories. So it's fairly simple what they need, but again, you can see here is those are the main things that we need for an insured to get a quote. Let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the hurricane policy. So this is an add-on to other programs. So you cannot buy a HIP policy on its own. So essentially you can buy up to a 95% coverage with this. It does require that underlying, in this case, NVS policy. And what they do is they use NOAA data to essentially show rainfall, wind speeds, things like that. So it's a third party that they're using to essentially pay those claims off of that. In addition to the HIP program, there's also another option that's available with that. It's called tropical storm, and I'll touch on those here in a second. So the benefits of the HIP policy are you can buy a 1 to 100% of the deductible. So again, you buy 95%, you can actually reduce what that total amount is to essentially adjust your premium to where a producer wants that at. These are all subsidized at 65%, so the producer is paying 35% on all these covered ranges. Again, we're using NOAA data to track which counties would experience that hurricane force winds. So again, that's going to be something that's going to be published 2 to 3 weeks after the storm event to see if they qualify for a loss. And then if there is a loss, that HIP policy is going to be paid out the entire value of it. Whereas a tropical storm option, it's going to pay 50% of what the HIP would be. So I'll go through an example of how this will work. I guess, first of all, let's talk about where this is available. So you can see any place within the U.S. where there's red, those counties, those all have a HIP policy available for all those areas. So here's the example I was talking about. So $100,000 of total, let's say in this case, you have 100,000 within a category. You carry a 65% policy. That's again 65,000 of coverage on the base policy, and then you can add the HIP coverage on top of that. In this case, so 95% total. So that's 65 underlying, 30,000 on the HIP coverage, and a $5,000 deductible. If there's a qualifying event, then the HIP policy would pay the entire $30,000 on that policy. So the HIP policy, you can add this tropical storm, which is an option in addition to the HIP policy. And basically what this does is it looks at that same NOAA data. So to qualify for that, you have to have at least 6 inches of rain over 4 consecutive days. And this wind speed must reach at least 39 miles an hour. So again, those are kind of the qualifications for the tropical storm. And the way that works is that it's essentially going to trigger 50% of what the hurricane policy is. Now, again, you can have more than one qualifying event, but each time it gets paid out. So an example, you get one tropical storm, it's going to pay, in this, our scenario before, where there's that $30,000 total, it would pay half of that, so $15,000. If you had a second qualifying event, whether another tropical storm or a hurricane, it would pay the remainder of that. So again, you can't go over top of that entire amount, but again, it's going to be 50% for a tropical storm, and the second one would be the other 50%, or the full amount total if there was a hurricane. So again, the application process for that, again, the insured applies for that with your underlying coverage. And once you apply for that, there is that 30-day waiting period. And then 31st day that coverage will come in place once the application has been approved by the insurance provider. Okay, so let's talk about some loss history since this policy has been in place. So this map shows, it's kind of small here, but you can see that the darker the color, the more times it's paid out. This is from July to February of 2025. So over the course of those years, the darker the color, which shows the darkest color, is 4 times, and the lightest, of course, is 0. But the pink colors would be a tropical storm payout. So you can see there's been a lot of areas that have had quite a few payouts over that course of time. So let's switch gears and talk about the controlled environment policy. So this is new for the crop year of 2024. You can write this with a nursery value select policy, but the biggest thing to understand is that this is very similar to the NVS policy. It just has different covered perils. So your adverse weather policy, or adverse weather, was definitely part of what the NVS policy is. Basically, the controlled environment policy, the perils are going to be destruction order for plants due to a plant disease or contamination that happened within that, for that individual controlled environment. So, and there also would be covered for quarantine with a recommendation to destroy those individual plants. So again, those are really the covered perils for the controlled environment policy. So destruction order, and then the quarantine, but with, again, a recommendation to destroy. So the coverage levels are very similar as the NVS policy. It's a 50 to 75% coverages with a 5% increments as part of that. Sales closing, again, which is when these applications need to be done by, are going to be May 1st for your Atlantic Coast states, the Gulf Coast states, and West Virginia, and then all the other states are going to be September 1st. But again, it's not a hard deadline. You have that additional 30-day waiting periods. You can get coverage in that. They would just prorate those premiums, and then that coverage would, again, be prorated based upon when you actually apply for that coverage and it gets accepted. So as far as the CE policy, these have to be part of a fully enclosed permanent structure. The growers must also have a self-certified biosecurity protocol that goes with that. And again, you have to be grown in optimal growing conditions. And then the other thing is going to be that still with that 40% of the gross income must be from wholesale clients. So you are essentially selling to the retailers who sell, to those end users. Landscape contractors will be, essentially selling to those that would qualify for that wholesale. Government entities or organizations, and then selling to commercial fruit, vegetable, plants, and plant products. So again, this is very similar to the NVS in the fact of you have to have that 40% wholesale. So again, the product itself, your coverage is that destruction order for plant diseases, contamination introduced into the controlled environment and no fault of the operator. So it, again, has to be unknowingly introduced into this operation. And again, the grower must have executed their biosecurity plan for this to be a covered peril. So what are some of the benefits and challenges of the CE policy? So again, the benefits are it's one insured for that loss, disease, contamination. It is a simple application process, and also the renewal is fairly simple as well. Your inventory is not required to apply at the time. So again, you can add inventory later on, but again, it's based upon kind of your history as far as what you typically grow and that sort of thing. It is a very customizable policy, very similar to the NVS. Prices are determined from the producer sales history. You can have other insurance on the same plants. And then the challenges are going to be that you have thousands of plants on one policy, a very fluctuating inventory, and there's no real typical operation. So this could be, what types of protection, the time to market, production practices, all those different things that are part of this. Then the next thing is going to talk about the individual coverages. So there's three essentially production practices: soil, hydroculture, and then other growing media. And then there's different what we consider coverage types. So you have a very basic coverage, which is a catastrophic or CAT coverage. And there's also a buy-up coverage, considered the additional coverages for those. And again, the value of time here, I'm going to continue to kind of go through this. So there are 10 different plant categories that fall under the CE. And again, you can decide, the grower can decide what they want to cover for those individual plant categories. So you can see those here. And again, an agent can help decide what would fall within each of those categories. Availability, as I said before, here's where the CE policy is currently available in the US. These are the May 1st sales closing. Again, that's not a hard deadline. Other states that are available, you can see here, is a September 1 sales closing or application deadline. So I know I'm at our 20 minutes here, so I want to make sure that we have enough time for some questions. So again, here's our contact information at Carden. If you want to reach out at some point in time and ask more questions, get additional information, we'd be happy to help you or any growers that you know that are interested in looking at this policy or any of these policies.
Thanks for that, Errol. It's been a very different talk for this one, but actually completely and utterly relevant, it has to be said. People do tend to forget about this. Also, from a UK perspective, I'm completely envious that you have a subsidised insurance structure, because we have nothing like that in the UK.
Yep.
Anyway, so interesting questions. I'm getting the feel from the policies you've talked about there, they're just specifically for the produce, not the growing infrastructure as well.
That is correct. So it is just for the plants that are produced.
So presumably, if you want to insure the infrastructure, that's just the classic kind of buildings insurance.
Correct. That's your property casualty. Yes. Yep.
Cool. Okay, that's fine. So what's the feel for how heavily this is used in the mix and match? I mean, do most people have all of the ones you're talking about, or some of them? Well, if you're not in the tropical storm area, you're not going to have that one, obviously. But do almost all growers have both of the key policies?
Well, the NVS policy is, it depends on where you're located at. How, there's a lot of nursery growers that carry coverage, and there's a lot of them that, again, the NVS policy is fairly new. It's been available for a couple of years now, but the old field-grown container policy had a lot of strict requirements, reporting requirements. They had to do monthly reporting, and so it was a very tedious policy. So a lot of producers did not participate because of that tediousness of that. So a lot more have decided that the NVS policy, especially for nursery growers, has become much more advantageous and easier to operate within.
Cool. So you're in an interesting environment at the moment in the States. Is this insurance setup likely to change? Is there any, or is that fairly well bedded? It does look like the US Agriculture Department is going to back out of anything.
Yeah, I think that the USDA, again, these are administered from the RMA, but basically they're always willing to look at changes. And again, these have changed in the last 3 years. I've been in the crop insurance industry since 2007, and every year there's changes.
Okay.
So, but the overall, they try and make things better for the producers, but overall they like to make sure that the policies are, fit within that. I know we've had some discussions with the Controlled Environment Alliance, CA, and about trying to maybe add some additional coverages for the CE policy. So we've been trying to reach out to RMA to see if we can make some changes or suggestions on how we can improve those.
Cool. Okay, thanks. You've explained what to a scientist is an incredibly complex area very well. So thanks very much for that.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we'll draw this to a close. So if you are looking for advice or interest on this, please contact Errol through the networking piece at the back. His details are all there, so you've probably got them already. And I'm sure you'll get plenty of interest, Errol. Thank you for your interest and presentation.
Thank you.
Cheers.